So, for our kind of teacher model example for today's lesson, I'm going to be reading a text to you, which is on my screen right now, that you can also read through. That is going to help kind of set up our major topic for today, which is kind of what were the major obstacles faced by freed people or slaves after the Civil War. But specifically, while I read this text, the example question that I would be looking for if I were doing this my own is what were the major disagreements about land in the South after the Civil War? So, if this was my question, I'm going to show you how I would read and break down this text to answer this question. And this will help you kind of understand your own readings for later, too, because these are, again, very important connected issues. So, you can either read it on the Google form, but again, I would much more recommend that you go to your Google Doc that is linked in the assignment because I have put specific vocabulary words in there for you, and you can just highlight and code it yourself, which will help for finding quotes later. So starting to read the text, first I'm already knowing what is the question that I'm looking for first. Previewing the questions is a good step. I am looking for what were the major disagreements about land in the South. So in the reading, there are these first few questions kind of proposing it. Starting at the top, what would the freed people need in order to sustain their freedom? And what, if anything, were freed people entitled to in compensation for past labor as slaves? So were they kind of owed anything? These are the questions I read. So starting with the reading here. One response to these questions was supplied by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman after his January 1865 meeting with freed people, known as the Savannah Colloquy. Sherman issued Special Field Order 15 on January 16, 1865, which ordered 400,000 acres of land along the coasts of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to be divided into 40-acre plots and provided to freed people and their families. So kind of I was saying like, okay, well, while the war was still going on, a major Union general kind of took some of this land that they had taken from some of the rich Southern slave owners and already started kind of dividing it up and breaking it up into small sections and was giving it already to slaves that were being freed. So starting off, I'm already knowing that slaves were given land to kind of create farms and create some sort of like opportunity for them to choose their own lives. So in the middle of the second paragraph, or first paragraph in here still, on smaller scales throughout other parts of the South, freed people had either claimed or been granted abandoned lands in territories controlled by the Union Army. But by late spring of 1865, many Southern planters were returning to claim the land that they had left behind. So as we know, kind of like reviewing, I'm activating my background knowledge here. I already know that the South was majorly mostly farms, very large farms called plantations, where there was like a slave owner or a plantation owner who didn't actually work on the farm; he just owned it. And this massive farm was run by and worked by slaves. But during the war, a lot of these farms were kind of either abandoned, the slave owners or plantation owners ran off, and the Union generals were like, hey, look, here's a bunch of land, former slaves, now free people. Go ahead and work it. It's yours. And this probably was a pretty great deal for these people being like, yeah, cool. Now we actually have land of our own. We can work it, and this will help us a lot. But the second paragraph here. Would it be just to return confiscated and abandoned land, such as that distributed to freed peoples by Sherman's field order, to the people who had owned it, in some cases for generations before the war? Or would it be more just to give some or all of it to the former slaves whose families had labored it for generations? So this is kind of setting up what are these major disagreements. So on one hand, you have the former slaves who are saying we had worked this land forever, and this is the reason that this land made money. So after the war, this land should go to us, the former slaves. But then again, as we see the former landowners, these plantation former slave owners are coming back and being like, hey, war's over. I want my farm/plantation back. But now there's these former slaves living on it. So it's kind of like, well, who gets the land? Is it the slaves, former now free people who should be able to have this land? Or is it the plantation owners who had enslaved them? Who should this land go to? So reading again, the answers to those questions would have profound or important implications or consequences for how the competing demands of justice and healing would be addressed during Reconstruction. If confiscating land from Southern planters and giving it to freed people would be an act of justice, it would also most certainly set back the process of healing, while Americans who supported the Confederacy and those who supported the Union. How the nation resolved this dilemma or problem would also provide evidence about how the post-war United States would define its universe of obligation, or kind of what do we owe to people. So kind of wrapping it all up, first I'm seeing that there is a pull between who owns the land in the South. And during the war, the rich landowning slave owners had abandoned their major giant farms and plantations, and the slaves had just started living there and picking it up and were doing great, kind of just having small farms on these former plantations. But then the war is over. These rich slave landowners show up and say, hey, we want our farms back, and essentially want to kick these former slaves, now free people, off this land that they say belongs to them. So the question is, who does this land really belong to, and who should get it, and what will be the consequences of giving this land to either one side or the other? And we're going to look at this in your own readings as we go. So that's how I would answer the question. There are two competing sides. One side wants to give the land to the former slaves to help them, and one side wants to give the land back to the former plantation slave owners because they think it's theirs and that'll make things better. And this is a poll between the two sides that we're going to see in your own readings. So make sure when you're reading on your own, you're activating your background knowledge, looking at the questions first, and then kind of asking yourself questions as you go. And this is what you're going to do on your own in these readings for today.